φωτογραφίες που θα δείτε είναι από το έργο μας, επάνω στα νέα τμήματα, στα Τέμπη και στον Πλαταμόνα, που βρίσκεται σε εξέλιξη. Αυτή τη στιγμή είμαστε γύρω στο 82% και αναμένουμε να τελειώσουμε σύντομα αυτό το έργο. Θα κάνω την παρουσία μάλλον στα αγγλικά, οπότε δεν θα χρειάζεται και μετάφραση, αφού όλοι μας καταλαβαίνουμε αγγλικά. Εδώ βλέπετε μια φωτογραφία από την τρίτη σύραγγα, στη φάση της επένδυσης που γίνεται στη σύραγγα, αφού πρώτα γίνει η διάνοιξη. Να πω ότι δουλεύω για τη Hochtief εδώ και 15 χρόνια, σε διάφορα έργα και στην Ελλάδα αλλά και στο εξωτερικό. Στην Ελλάδα σε 2 έργα μέχρι στιγμής, στο αεροδρόμιο και τώρα στο έργο Μαλιακός Κλειδί. So I will concentrate on the following 5 points. A quick history about the infrastructure projects in Greece, the challenges of PPP projects, which are fairly complex undertakings, the prerequisites for private investments, which are needed, especially in Greece, the critical success factors and the conclusion. So if we look at the history of infrastructure projects in Greece, there was a first generation of 3 very successful and very needed projects. The Athens Airport project, which was completed on time and on budget, as opposed to other big airport projects like in Berlin, in Germany at the moment, which is a disaster, but also Attiki Odos and the Rio Antirio Bridge. This project started mid-90s and were completed early in the decade of 2000, all of them before the Olympic Games, which was a milestone, an important national milestone, and certainly gave a driver for those projects to be completed and were a basis for a good cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. Then we have what I call the second generation of projects. There were tendered in 2007 5 highways, which you can see here, a very ambitious program at the time to complete all necessary highways at once in Greece, all of them with a PPP model, with demand risk, with private finance, and with a lot of risks mainly undertaken by the private sector. Hochtief is involved in 2 of those projects, the Aegean Motor Project, Maliakos Klidi, so the purple one, this one, and the other one is Olympia Odos, the blue one. The total investment for all those projects was more than 7 billion euro, so a big boost certainly for the national economy. And however, the financial crisis, as explained by Mr. Simopoulos, led to a suspension of works almost to all of those projects. It took 3 years to restructure those projects, and this restructuring process was successfully completed end of last year, as opposed to other projects in other European countries where the restructuring failed. So I would say that this was a successful exercise, although it took quite long, and now the projects are progressing, the construction is progressing in order to complete those important transport projects for the country. What are the challenges of PPP projects? Certainly risk allocation is a big challenge. The problem is that the public sector in many countries does not understand risk. By saying this, I mean that normally a public budget is set up, and if the projects are delayed and the budget is exceeded, then there is an adjustment of this budget the next calendar year, and everything is fine. This, of course, is not the approach of the private sector. Demand and sovereign risks, or country risks, are the most profound risks in project finance. A challenge for the investors is the forecast, a very long-term forecast, and the business planning exercise. Construction risks, and you can see here a picture of a tunnel. You never know the exact characteristics of the geology in order to be sure that you will finish the tunnel on time. To give one example, the same applies with other projects. So time and budget are the big challenges in big construction projects. And finally, the bankability and long-term financing. Times have changed. We are not in the good old days before 2007, where there was plenty of money and debt around for 100 basis points. Times have changed, so long-term debt is hardly available, and the margins have certainly increased. What the crisis can do, you can see on the left side down there. You can see on the top the original forecasted traffic and the actual traffic after the crisis. Those projects lost roughly 50% of the traffic, and that correlates, of course, to revenue, and that was a main reason for the restructuring of the projects. So the benefit of PPPs is that the risks are explicitly dealt with and they are not hidden. They have to become explicit. And as I said already, demand and sovereign risks are the ones that the finance community is looking on. What are the prerequisites to attract private investments? There has to be an acceptable country risks. So nobody would make a PPP project in a Middle East country with high risks, or in a country where the legal environment is uncertain, etc. So country risk, acceptable country risk and minimal rating is a must. Legal stability. Since these are long-term investments, so a concession project is an investment, most times over 20, 30, 40 years or even longer. So legal stability is important, and the contract that is signed must be valid not only today but also in 30 years. Clear pricing regulation. These are regulated projects, of course, and competition rules are important as well. Investors would not rely on local courts. They will certainly demand international ICC rules, dispute resolution rules. Countries with a long-term expected positive macroeconomic environment are interesting for such investments, and an acceptable demand risk is necessary, although demand risk becomes less and less, it becomes more and more difficult to be accepted by the finance community. And of course, protection from tax risk changes, law changes, etc. Finally, the project must be bankable. What are now the critical success factors? If you look at the simple life cycle of a project, the planning phase, the construction phase, and the operation. During the planning phase, the project design, the project structure must be well thought through. You need experts and very experienced people to do this, because this can lead to a success or a failure of a project. The public acceptance of such big projects is very, very important. The project must be acceptable for the user. It must provide a benefit to the user. The facilities, the service, etc. The PPP model, there are different models, is very important. If you look, for instance, at the Athens Airport model, this still is a very successful model on international level. And then the bankability we talked about. Environmental impacts must be considered. And also the tendering process is important. So it is not beneficial if a tendering process takes 2-3 years. Investors, investment funds want to have a streamlined tendering process which takes a few months and not many years, and is postponed again and again. All this phase may take from 2 up to 10 years until a project is mature, is tendered, and can commence, can be signed, financially closed, and commence. Then we have the construction phase. Expropriations and permits are not a given in Greece, unfortunately. Expropriations is a huge issue in Greece. They're always late and very costly. Construction management is with the investor. He takes that risk and he needs to manage that. The funding mix is important in order not suddenly to create a funding shortfall in the middle of the construction phase and not being able to complete the construction. And the independent engineer is a common best practice, meanwhile, in order to provide an independent body between the client, the government, and the private investor on the other side. Normally, construction projects take 4 to 5 years. In our cases here, we lost 3 years to the crisis, so instead of 5 years, we'll need a bit longer. Operation, when the construction is completed, it is important to provide operational excellence, to expand facilities according to demand. The return on investment is, of course, important, but here investors take a very long-term view. They don't want to, it's not important to make the quick money here. They want, they're happy to make on the long run a return. And very important, even maybe the most important, is the long-term PPP partnership, which is important between the private and the public sector. As I said, this is a phase which can last 30 years or more. So planning maturity and project bankability will determine the chances for a project success. If those two or one of those two things are not given, then the project will certainly fail to a larger or a smaller extent. 80% of future problems are created or solved during the planning phase. And this is why this phase is so important to be done correctly. So concluding, PPP projects, and this is the topic of the conference, have no chance to succeed without a functioning public sector and efficient administration. So this is very important. Without this, the private investor cannot proceed by himself. He needs the support, the cooperation of the public sector. The governments need to understand project risks. They cannot just transfer the risk to the public sector, sign a contract, and then escape, hoping that everything will be fine. The project design must consider public acceptance of a project on one hand and the bankability requirements of the finance community on the other hand. It's important to test the waters before involving the private sector in a project. And a professional tender procedure with a fixed timetable is the first step for a successful execution. The more parties are interested, the better for the tender, for the government. The involvement of multilateral institutions like the EIB, etc., is not a must, but in certain areas necessary. It will certainly add trust and stability to a project. And the aligned interest and the true partnership between private and public sector will ensure a long-term success. I personally believe that the Hellenic Republic has a good chances for further successful PPP projects and privatizations. Some are underway, airports, roads and harbors, provided it can capitalize on past lessons learned and by applying international best practice. Thank you very much for your attention.